You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Grown-ups, if there's a child in your life who is interested in, curious about, or fascinated by people and places from history, then my podcast, The Past and the Curious, might just be a hit in your home. From the invention of microscopes to world-traveling dogs to fashions of the 1890s, gold rush ghost towns, and audiences going wild for walking competitions, we've got a little bit of it all. Hosted by children's author and museum educator Mick Sullivan, that's me, the show is fun, funny, engaging, honest, and beloved by kids and parents alike. Find The Past and the Curious at all the usual podcast places.
No one hates history, they just haven't found the right teacher yet. Or in this case, a nerdy best friend who loves to tell you all about world history, women's history, and weird history. Hi, I'm TK, the creator of For the Love of History podcast, a place for people who want to learn more but don't know where to start, and history lovers who want to break from the mainstream. From rat trials to warrior women, we cover topics from every country and era. Whether you're a history expert or just starting out, there's a place for you here in the Time Machine. So join me every Friday on your favorite podcast platform and YouTube for a brand new topic. See you there. Bye.
This episode is brought to you by our Patreon members. Thank you so much.
Join our Patreon for extra episodes, interviews, extra content, and to help support the podcast and help us continue to do the work we do.
Go to patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl to learn more.
Her reactions were quick and courageous, indeed, even reckless.
I'm Jenny Williamson.
And I'm Jen McMenemy.
And this is Ancient History Fangirl.
The More Goths edition.
Goths, 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 everywhere you look, because somebody asked me to triangulate the Goths, much like somebody asked Jordanes.
Hopefully you did it in a less problematic manner?
I cannot guarantee that, but fingers crossed. Anyway, in our last episode, we told you all about the rise of Theodoric the Great and the founding of the Ostrogothic Kingdom in Italy. Now, we're going to tell you all about the women in his family and the effect they had on his kingdom and their roles and how badass they were. It's said that before becoming king of the Ostrogoths, while he was still living in Moesia, Theodoric had a concubine. That could mean anything from a sex slave or a courtesan to a wife in an interfaith Christian marriage. We don't know. We don't know this concubine's name or really anything about her, but we do know that they had 2 children together, who we'll get to, and that after he established the Ostrogothic Kingdom in 493 AD, Theodoric married the sister of a powerful rival, King Clovis I of the Franks. Her name was Ostrogothica. I have no idea if his concubine / potentially first wife was dead at that point, or maybe they consciously uncoupled, or what. I don't know.
Or he was in a plural marriage. We don't know.
That's the most unlikely version, really.
Agreed. So, this would have been a hugely important marriage. By this point in history, the Goths were not the only large confederation of Germanic people who formed largely to defend themselves against Rome or sack it, depending on the day.
It's not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, you can be 2 things at once.
You can do both, okay?
Goals. So, the Franks were another group. They were a group of non-Gothic Germanic people living in the area called Gaul. They were new converts to Catholicism, the only large Germanic group at the time that wasn't Arian, and they were aggressive. They had already proved a powerful threat to the Visigothic kingdom. Having their alliance meant that Theodoric could keep his own new kingdom secure, and also hopefully protect the Visigoths.
We don't know that much about Ostrogothica. The only background I could find on her was that she was a pagan before converting to Arian Christianity when she married Theodoric, which makes me think that Clovis's conversion to Catholicism hadn't happened yet. I'm not 100% sure on that. She is said to have died around 511 AD at the age of roughly 44. Theodoric also had a sister, Amalasuintha. We don't know when she was born, only that it was sometime before 475 AD, the year her dad and uncles won their independence from the Huns, which would make her Theodoric's older sister. Again, the dates here are a bit fuzzy. Amalasuintha grew up in the armies of her father and uncles and then later her brother, surrounded by war and upheaval on all sides. Her childhood and young adulthood was no doubt spent tramping after armies over the Alps multiple times. She grew up camping. And unlike her brother, she wasn't sent to Constantinople to get a Roman education, at least as far as I know.
Perhaps she got a different kind of education, learning how to ride a horse, skin small game and hunt, start a fire, fight off an attacker, lead an army. I'd like to imagine Amalasuintha as a tough, outdoorsy type. Maybe someone more accustomed to falling asleep on the hard ground than in a soft bed. Maybe she spent time on the front lines, either fighting or supporting the warriors, and providing battlefield first aid. This is our fan fiction, but as history is quite vague, why not write that fan fiction?
This goes all the way back to Tacitus, this idea that the wives and also the children of Gothic warriors were joined to their husbands in adventure, in war, in migration, in all of that. These were not women who stayed behind. So this is a really ancient tradition of women following their menfolk, following their families in battle. They would have been there. They would have been there providing an active support role, and some of them fighting in the army.
Yeah, and we know that. Like, everything in history tells us that. So, it's not that uneducated a fan fiction to have. So, Amalasuintha got married at some point before her brother became king of the Ostrogoths. We don't know who her husband was, but we do know she had 2 children with him, Theodahad and Amalaberga.
Notice that the first names of these women, a lot of them start with the word Amal, not a coincidence.
Amalasuintha's husband disappears from the sources, and historians think he died at some point. Amalasuintha was probably a widow when in 500 AD, 7 years after establishing the Ostrogothic Kingdom and marrying off both his daughters, Theodoric married her off to Thrasimund, king of the North African Vandals. Amalasuintha's husband would have been about 50 at this time.
Amalasuintha didn't go to her new husband empty-handed. She went like a warrior queen, with a small private army of 1,000 elite Gothic warriors and 5,000 armed retainers. We don't know what their marriage was like. We do know that several ancient sources refer to Thrasimund as a scholar king, quote-unquote. I love the idea that he was kind of nerdy and shy and bookish, while she was a tough outdoor survivalist, and that they got along great. I just love that. Like, in my mind, this is like an older romance. They've both been married before, or at least had relationships before, and it's kind of like a second chance romance.
It's not a second chance romance. It's not. This is a later in life romance. We don't know that these 2 met each other at one point in time and then got separated. That's usually how a second chance romance works. But this is definitely like a later in life romance. Yeah, like a good example of a second chance romance is like you were childhood best friends and then you're like separated for like 10 or 15 years and then you get together. Like that's more of a second chance romance.
Oh, that's totally not what I meant by that. Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I did not realize. I was thinking of like, a second chance at love in that they had other relationships and then got together when they were older, which, yeah, a later in life romance. That's what I'm seeing between these 2 very opposites attract people that are kind of gender non-conforming. If somebody wants to write that, I will read it. Anyway, so Thrasimund died in 523 AD after 23 years of marriage to Amalasuintha. He would have been in his 70s. When he died, his cousin Hilderic took over, and that's where the trouble started. See, Amalasuintha, like most Goths, was an Arian Christian. When Hilderic became king, he recalled a bunch of Catholic bishops who had been exiled under Thrasimund.
Amalasuintha objected to this so strongly that she called up her small army of Goths and hired some Moorish mercenaries and led them all into battle at Capsa, about 300 miles south of Carthage on the northern edge of the Libyan desert. She lost to Hilderic, who arrested her and had all her Gothic soldiers put to death. Amalasuintha died in prison in about 523 AD.
So not that long after her husband, the same year, really.
Which again just shows you how tenuous women's lives were and how much they were so tied to their husbands.
Absolutely, yeah.
So, when Theodoric heard about his sister's death, he was enraged. He was actually making plans to invade the Vandal kingdom and get justice for his sister when he died of dysentery, or maybe it was seeing a scary fish head, or maybe it was some creepy bird omen, or maybe he was thrown into a volcano, or maybe he was carried off by selkies.
Sources vary on that.
The sources are super, super vague here. As a result of his death, Amalasuintha's death went unavenged.
Theodoric had 3 daughters, Ostrogotho, Theodogotha, and Amalasuintha. These are quite epic names that are also quite multisyllabic, and I am absolutely guessing at the pronunciation. Ostrogotho and Theodogotha were his daughters with his unnamed concubine, and Amalasuintha was his daughter with Autofleda. So let's start with the oldest one. The oldest was Theodogotha. who was born maybe in 473 AD, although we don't know for sure. Like Amalasuintha, she grew up camping and trailing behind armies. When she was a baby, her dad was roving around Thrace and Pannonia and the mountains of Eastern Europe, fighting it out with the Squinter. She would have been around 16 when her dad went to Italy to fight Odoacer. Theodoric took her and her sister and mom along with him because, as we said before, this is a very ancient Gothic tradition. The year after Theodoric took control in Italy in 494 AD, he married Theodogotha off at the age of 21 to Alaric II, great-grandson of that Alaric, allegedly. At this point, Alaric II was king of the Visigoths, who were in Toulouse, I believe at the time. They were in Gaul. And it is questionable whether he was actually related to Alaric I. People say they were related, they might not have been. Alaric II might have been about 36 by then, although that is also a guess.
As we said, we don't know what her marriage to Alaric II was like. We do know that they had one son, Amalaric, and that Alaric II died in 507 AD in battle with King Clovis I of the Franks. Theodogotha would have been about 34 at this point. Alaric II's death pissed off Theodoric, who was, I guess, still alive.
Yeah, he was alive at this point, yes. This is several decades before he dies.
Yeah, Clovis was his ally through marriage, but that didn't save his son-in-law. Isidore of Seville says that upon hearing what happened, quote, Theodoric, the king of Italy, upon hearing of the death of his son-in-law, immediately set out from Italy, crushed the Franks, recovered the part of the kingdom which the forces of the enemy had occupied, and restored it to the authority of the Goths.
Veni, vidi, vici. Veni, vidi, vici. Made it look easy.
I mean, yeah, but they weren't Latin.
They were, especially Theodoric himself, quite Romanized. The Ostrogothic Kingdom has been called the most Romanized kingdom of all the Gothic kingdoms. There were, as far as I'm aware, 2. So the bar is low.
Anyway, so Theodoric basically rode into the Visigothic kingdom and took control. Since Theodogotha's son, Amalaric, was too young to rule, he would have been about 5 at this point, Theodoric ruled the Visigoths himself until Amalaric came of age, temporarily creating a Gothic superstate.
We know very little about Theodogotha's life, but I like to imagine that, as Theodoric's oldest daughter who came of age stateless and homeless, that she was practical and down to earth. She would have grown up a Goth, among warriors, probably learning to ride a horse and at least competently handle a weapon herself, I'm imagining. Maybe how to act as support for men in the trenches, bringing food and providing medical care, or maybe fighting herself. I imagine that she looked up to her aunt Amalasuintha and learned everything from her. This is all fan fiction, again, but why not? The gaps are just there to fill.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
Hello everyone, Takuya here.
And I'm Gabby.
And we are the hosts of History of Everything, a podcast which you can probably guess by the name is, well, it's about everything. Do you want to know why people thought potatoes were evil and would give you syphilis? Are you curious about all the stories of the terrible and stupid ways that people have kicked the bucket over the years? Do you want to hear tales about all of the different badasses of history and the lives that they had brought to life? Well, if so, then look no further. History of Everything is just the right podcast for you. It's available on Spotify, Pandora, and anywhere else that you get your podcast from. Join us for some fun and just see how weird and wacky history can be.
Throughout history, royals across the world were notorious for incest. They married their own relatives in order to consolidate power and keep their blood blue. But they were oblivious to the havoc all this inbreeding was having on the health of their offspring. From Egyptian pharaohs marrying their own sisters to the Habsburgs' notoriously oversized lower jaws. I explore the most shocking incestuous relationships and tragically inbred individuals in royal history. And that's just episode 1.
On the History Tea Time podcast, I profile remarkable queens and LGBTQ+ royals, explore royal family trees, and delve into women's medical history and other fascinating topics. I'm Lindsay Holiday, and I'm spilling the tea on history. Join me every Tuesday for new episodes of the History Tea Time podcast, wherever fine podcasts are enjoyed.
Theodogotha had a little sister, Ostrogotho. Ostrogotho was born possibly in 475 AD, about 2 years younger than Theodogotha, but again, the dates are fuzzy. There's one way to calculate it where she's like 10 years younger. We have no idea. Ostrogotha was also a daughter of Theodoric's unnamed concubine. Her birth name was Ariadne, after the wife of the Emperor Zeno, but to differentiate her from that Ariadne, people started calling her Ostrogotho, and it stuck. She also trailed after her dad's army as he fought in Thrace and Moesia and Pannonia and eventually took over Italy. I like to imagine Ostrogotho as Theodogotha's worshipful little sister, trying to do everything her sister did: ride a horse, light a fire, hunt and skin animals, stab a cat collar, maybe skin him too and roast him over a fire because times were tough. I love imagining these fierce gothic girls and their cool aunt Amalasuintha. I love it. Fanfiction needs to be written about these women.
Absolutely. Anyway, Ostrogotho was roughly 18 years old when her dad took over Italy and married her to a Burgundian prince, Sigismund, who would have been about 18 too, so they were kind of about the same age, which is novel for the ancient world. This was also an important alliance for Theodoric. The Burgundians were another of those large, non-Gothic Germanic coalitions forming in the power vacuum left behind by Rome. They were also active in Gaul, near the border with Italy. Ostrogotho and Sigismund had a son and a daughter, Sigeric and Suavagotha. Ostrogotho died sometime before 516. She was about 41 at the time.
Sigismund remarried, and apparently his new wife did not get along with his kids at all, especially his son, Sigeric. At one point, on a feast day in 517, so not that long after the kid's mom died, Sigeric saw his stepmother wearing his dead mother's gown and said loudly, so everybody heard, that she didn't deserve to wear those clothes. He was right. According to Burgundian law, his sister Suavagotha should have inherited her mother's ceremonial gowns. In revenge, the stepmother poured poison in Sigismund's ear, Sigismund being the dad, convincing him that Sigeric, his own son, was plotting to overthrow him. On impulse, Sigismund ordered his men to sneak up on Sigeric while he was drinking, knock in a couple back, capture him, and drown him in a well. But Sigismund came to regret this. Oh dear, who could have predicted that?
As one does.
As you would think one does. Racked with guilt and grief, he retreated to a monastery and lived out his days in isolation. Meanwhile, Theodoric had to go to war against the Burgundians too to avenge his grandson in 522 or 523 AD, somewhere around there.
So 3 times Theodoric married off his relatives to strengthen relationships with other powerful Germanic groups that threatened his borders. And 3 times it blew up in his face. 3 times there was the necessity to invade. But Theodoric also had a 3rd daughter, because 3 is the magic number, and her name was Amalasuintha. And his strategy was different for her. Amalasuintha was the only child of Theodoric and Audufleda. She was born in 495 AD, making her 22 years younger than Theodogotha and 20 years younger than Ostrogotha. Maybe. The dates are kind of fuzzy here. Amalasuintha probably didn't know her older stepsisters very well. In fact, they were both married off before she was born. Even if she did get to talk to them, Amalasuintha would have led a very different life than her older stepsisters, and they may not have had a lot in common. Reed probably had nothing in common.
Ostrogotho and Theodogotha were tough Gothic women who'd grown up joining their male kin in war and adventure. They'd grown up camping. They were in their teen years before their dad even had a kingdom. But by the time Amalasuintha was born, her father was no longer a king with no kingdom. He was firmly established in his power, and her aunt Amalasuintha was married off by the time Amalasuintha was 5, so she didn't even get that relationship. Amalasuintha got a different childhood. She grew up in the halls of power. She grew up sleeping on soft beds, wearing fancy clothes, with servants or slaves who attended to her every need. She also received a Roman education, unlike her sisters as far as I'm aware. Theodoric saw that his daughter received the same education he did. She was tutored in the Roman style and raised to be passionate about Roman art and literature. She was also trilingual, speaking Latin, Greek, and Gothic. He was basically grooming her to be queen.
But here's the thing. She couldn't rule alone. She's a girl.
Ladies can't rule by themselves.
No, we don't know how to do that.
Our breasts get in the way.
My boob and my moon blood, you know?
Won't some man help me?
So, since she couldn't rule alone because of her breasts and her moon blood, Amalasuintha came of age, and Theodoric realized he had an heir problem. He was a girl dad. He'd had 3 daughters and no sons. He'd married off his daughters to various powerful princes outside his kingdom. And that hadn't stopped him from having to go to war with those rivals. And the last thing he wanted was to have the son of a Frank or a Burgundian or a Vandal inheriting his hard-won throne. So this time, when looking for a match for Amalasuintha, he did things a little differently. A little, maybe, unorthodox. The man he picked for Amalasuintha was a Gothic noble from the Ostrogothic Kingdom named Eutharic. Theodoric had a lot in common with him. Eutharic had grown up among Visigothic nobility, but had also been a son-in-arms to Justin I, the Eastern Roman Emperor. In a way, he also bridged 2 worlds, Roman and Gothic.
But that's not the only 2 worlds Eutharic connected. He was also a bridge between Visigoth and Ostrogoth, because even though he had deep connections in the Visigothic court, he was an Ostrogoth from the Amal family line. He and Theodoric shared a lineage going all the way back to Ermanaric, waiting on the shores of the Danube to defend his people from the Huns. In fact, Eutharic may have had even more unassailable Amal ancestry than Theodoric did, as he was a descendant of Ermanaric himself, whereas Theodoric was a descendant of Ermanaric's brother. So they say. It's not completely clear when Eutharic's family joined the Visigoths. Remember, a number of Greuthungi crossed the Danube River during the Gothic refugee crisis of 376, joining the Turvingi in the Gothic War and later becoming the Visigoths. And a number of Greuthungi nobles also fled Hunnic domination in the decades after and took refuge with the Visigoths. Eutharic's parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents could have been from either of those groups or maybe came to the Visigoths some other way. We don't know for sure. But also, this whole lineage of Eutharics, the connection to the Amal family line that went all the way back to Ermanaric, that also could have been invented.
Yeah, of course. Because according to Jordanes, after Alaric II died in battle, while Theodoric was over in Gaul defending the Visigoths from the Franks in roughly 511 AD, he discovered Eutharic, an Amal, and an Ostrogoth living among the Visigoths. He was so impressed by the young man's wisdom and valor and rude health.
Rude good health. How does Stacy Schiff say it about Mark Antony?
His rude health. I love it.
This guy is not going to die on me before he gives me an heir. That's what he's thinking.
Yeah, he's like, damn, this dude looks like a gladiator. He's a Hemsworth brother. I got this. So Theodoric brought him home and gave him the hand of his daughter, Amalasuintha, thus joining 2 illustrious lines of the Ostrogoths and making his dynasty even stronger, or so he thought. Jordanes makes sure to give a line of begets for Eutharic, pointing out exactly where his family line divided from Theodoric's to emphasize that his ancestry was just as strong as the king's. Modern historians mostly side-eye this. Some believe that Theodoric needed an heir who was going to preserve his family line, found a guy who looked the part, and fabricated his lineage for him with the help of Cassiodorus, and this was later repeated by Jordanes, and that also sounds correct to me.
Sounds super plausible, right? So, at the age of 20, roughly in 515 AD, Amalasuintha was married to Eutharic, who would have been about 35 at the time. The couple had 2 children, Madasuintha and Athalaric, and Theodoric could finally relax, his line assured, his heir lined up, everyone eating up all Cassiodorus's begats with a spoon. The future of his Ostrogothic kingdom was secure.
Was it though?
Well... This is Jenny.
And Jen.
From Ancient History Fangirl.
Here to tell you about Jenny's scorching, swoon-worthy enemy of my dreams.
In which the fearsome Visigothic general Alaric teams up with a boozy Roman princess to take on the Roman Empire.
Best-selling author Jennifer Saint says, quote, "While Alaric is rendered as a smoldering, irresistible, tortured hunk of a man who I'd happily read an entire book about, Julia is the most joyous protagonist, a Roman princess with a penchant for drinking, napping, and war strategy, who goes on a wild ride and carries the reader with her all of the way." I want to tell you what's fun about this book. It is one of my favorite romance tropes, enemies to lovers.
Touch her and die. He falls first and very hard.
Hot mess heroine who is always down for a wine o'clock or spending some time in a Scythian-themed weed sauna.
It's not a party until someone gets stabbed.
You can sack my city anytime.
Would rather get eaten by wolves than fall in love.
Unconventional found family.
It's all fun and games until your lover winds up in the Colosseum, Jan.
Never plan a revolution sober.
He'd burn the world for her.
Axe throwing for pleasure and kingship.
And my personal favorite, the history, is fuzzy.
Enemy of my dreams, wherever books are sold.
This episode is brought to you by Cologuard. Do you know what's really scary? Not screening for colon cancer when you turn 45. The Cologuard test is non-invasive, requires no special prep or time off work, and ships right to your door. In just 3 simple steps, Cologuard takes the scare out of colon cancer screening. If you're 45 or older and at average risk, ask your healthcare provider about the Cologuard test. Cologuard is available by prescription only. Learn more or request a prescription today at Cologuard.com/screen.
This episode is brought to you by Redfin. You're listening to a podcast, which means you're probably multitasking. Maybe even scrolling home listings on Redfin, saving homes without expecting to get them. But Redfin isn't just built for endless browsing. It's built to help you find and own a home. With agents who close twice as many deals, when you find the one, you've got a real shot at getting it. Get started at redfin.com. Own the dream.
Do you want to live longer, think faster, or just perform better at everything? I'm Dave Asprey, and I founded the biohacking movement to show you that you can take control of your own biology. I created the Human Upgrade podcast to show you exactly how. Discover the protocols that upgrade your mitochondria, optimize your brain, and transform your performance at every level from spiritual all the way down to your cells. You can learn from more than 1,400 people who have been on the show, including world-class scientists, and you can apply what works today by filter out the BS for you. Skip the guesswork, learn how to get the results to feel healthier and happier. Subscribe to the Human Upgrade podcast and start biohacking your life. You might really like the way you feel.
Eutharic died in 522. Just about 7 years later. We're not sure how he died. We do know that his death brought Theodoric's heir problem back, but perhaps Theodoric thought that by the time he died, Eutharic's son Athalaric would be old enough to rule. There is that hope, right? Like, okay, he's dead, but there's a son here. That was not to be, however. Theodoric died in 526 AD, just a few years after Athalaric was only 6 years old. I'm 6! Holding the Ostrogoths together was now the job of the last woman standing, Amalasuintha.
You know, I feel like that's so often the case in history. It's like, oh, thank goodness there's a woman standing here, because otherwise we've spent all the men in this line.
If only she could see around her tits.
And think around her moon blood.
Us poor lady folk. If only a man could help us.
Anyway, after Theodoric's death, Amalasuintha stepped in to rule as queen regent on behalf of her son. She ran into resistance right away. Theodoric, as we've seen, had made his share of enemies before he died, and there was a contingent of nobles at court who'd had it in for her dad and who now had it in for her. Particularly in this power vacuum, this was their time. The Ostrogothic Kingdom was divided. The Gothic elite were Arian Christians, but the Roman elite, and Theodoric had kept much of this intact to keep his kingdom stable, was Catholic. The Catholics were much less tolerant of other religions and sects. Well, it makes sense. The Catholics are much less tolerant of other religions and sects.
The Arians were fine with sexting, but the Catholics did not want to see any nudes on your phone. None.
No. They had chafed for years against Theodoric's refusal to, for instance, persecute the Jews because, you know, they're not great in the ancient world. To be fair, Theodoric had thrown the Pope in jail, where he died. I mean, we just got to throw that out there.
6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Yeah, I mean, you sometimes he wasn't great to the Catholics either. It's the ancient world. Everyone's awful.
Yes, I think that's the one takeaway from this podcast.
And maybe the modern world is the same. Maybe we've come nowhere in all these years.
We've learned nothing. So, there were people in Amalasuintha's court who had openly fantasized about her father getting dismembered by horses, dragged into hell, and tossed into volcanoes by those they saw as his victims. Anyway, Amalasuintha's son Athalaric was now 11. Actually, he was 6.
I'm 11.
6. I'm 6. And as a ruler, one of her first priorities was to make sure he was educated properly to prepare to be king himself one day. So she got the best tutor she could find to give Athalaric a Roman education just like she'd had, just like her dad had. The enemy nobles seized this as a pretext to cause dissension at court. Amalasuintha was going to make a wimpy beta cuck out of this kid, they said. He shouldn't be raised like a Roman aristocrat. He should be raised like a Goth. He should have to bathe naked in an icy stream every day and whatnot. He should learn to ride and fight and kill things.
He needed to make the Gothic kingdom great again.
Right, make Gothia great again.
So, the Gothic aristocrats exerted fierce pressure on Amalasuintha to make sure that her son got a military education, like a manly man, and didn't learn any of that girly grammar and how to spell and record things and all that, because it only mattered who you killed, not who tells the story.
Right, writing things down makes you a lady, but also trans people don't exist. Make it make sense.
But also, like, the person who tells the story down through history is the person who gets to control the narrative, regardless of what actually happened. Anyway, moving on. So, Procopius tells us that the Gothic nobility relentlessly set Athalaric against his mom. He said, quote, "Now Amalasuintha wished to make her son resemble the Roman princes in his manner of life, and was already compelling him to attend the school of a teacher of letters. And she chose out of 3 among the old men of the Goths, whom she knew to be prudent and refined, above all the others, and bade them live with Athalaric. But the Goths were by no means pleased with this, for because of their eagerness to wrong their subjects, they wished to be ruled by him more after the barbarian fashion." Oh my goodness.
It's called managing up, okay?
Yeah, on one occasion, the mother, finding the boy doing some wrong in his chamber, chastised him, and he in tears went off thence to the men's apartments. And some Goths who met him made a great to-do about this, and reviling Amalasuintha, insisted that she wished to put the boy out of the world as quickly as possible, in order that she might marry a second husband, and with him rule over the Goths and the Italians. I mean, that's dark, that's bleak. They're like, she just wants to kill her son and get remarried and have another kid. Like, what?
I think it's really interesting that it says they wished to be ruled by him more after the barbarian fashion. So they wanted to design who their king was and how they were to be ruled. Like, managing up, that's what it is.
Well, and again, that's that schism, right? Like, we talked about this, and we talked about the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, right? Like, there is a divide in how these two cultures evolved based on their interactions with the Huns or the Romans. And so, like, you can see here in this, Gothic kingdom, you're really coming up against it. Some are like, no, this isn't our traditions or how we want to be ruled. We want to be ruled like this. And, I do think you're probably looking at, like, this idea that they're in one place with one type of rule trying to unite them. And they're like, no, that's not what we like, dude.
Yeah, and we also talked about this in the last episode, the idea of, like, this ancient Gothic culture. Like, they'd really been separated from that based on, the period under Hunnic domination. Like, they'd taken on a lot of Hunnic culture and things like that and separated from their own culture and history. So this idea of, like, what is truly Gothic, back to the ancient roots, like, that probably had, like, this real cultural capital at this point because they felt disconnected from it. So that might have been part of it as well.
Absolutely. And I think, both Visigoths and Ostrogoths are coming together to form this sort of like Gothic state, right? But both of their cultures, as you said, have been separated in different ways.
Yeah, and there's also a lot of Romans in this Ostrogothic court. Like, I think it might be a rebellion against being more Romanized, because there are a lot of clashes between the Roman elite and the Gothic elite in the Ostrogothic Kingdom. One of those schisms is religious because of Catholicism versus Arianism, but it's also cultural. So according to Procopius, the Gothic nobles banded together and sat down with Amalasuintha and said, look, we can't have a king who knows how to read. That is some weak, cowardly, beta cuck shit, and we as Goths cannot have it. Think of your dad, the mighty Theodoric. He didn't know how to read, and he took over a whole kingdom. Now there was a man.
But he did know how to read.
Well, yeah, that's kind of the point. Of course, Theodoric knew how to read, probably in several languages. He had been highly educated in the Roman fashion, so this is obviously not true. No doubt the proud Amalasuintha was furious at all this haranguing, but the nobles were powerful enough that she didn't want to defy them entirely. Think of Theodoric! He didn't know how to read!
Yeah, and it's one of these things that always, it always sticks with me, obviously, as a lay historian and a writer, right? Who controls the narrative is so important. Being able to read and write and document these things, that's how we know things that happened years and years ago. It's also how we know probably some of that isn't true. Things have lenses. So, these are people who are you don't need to read and write. You just need to make Gothia great again. And it's just or we could learn from the past.
Knowledge is power. So, Amalasuintha couldn't really go against these nobles entirely because they were too powerful. But one of their demands was actually kind of reasonable, that Athalaric should get to hang out with boys his own age. That was an easy one. Amalasuintha said, sure, why not? Let the kid hang out with the other boys his own age. If I give in on this, maybe they'll back off on everything else.
But Athalaric's new friends turned out to be a very bad influence, shocker. They got him into drinking and partying and having lots of sex.
He was probably older than 6 at this point. He's in his teens now. We've aged him up.
This is all not to mention that they helped cement his opposition to anything that his mom wanted him to do. I mean, this is typical rebellious teen behavior, right? As a teen, Athalaric defied his mom at every turn, undermining her with the nobles, who were now openly calling for her to abdicate her position and leave it to this sex-crazed partying teenager. That sounds great.
And of course, he would need, advisors to be the power behind the throne. And who would those advisors be?
Amalasuintha refused to give way before these guys, with the support of the Roman Emperor Justinian in the east, who was a very close personal friend of hers. Amalasuintha banished some of the worst ringleaders to the front lines of a war zone and had the others purged. By putting her foot down and flexing her muscles, Amalasuintha restored order to her court and sent a strong message that disrespect would not be tolerated.
Even as all this was happening, however, Athalaric succumbed to peer pressure and became an exceptionally depraved youth, quote-unquote. It's said that at the age of 17, he attended an absolute rager, probably against his mom's orders. He was never quite the same after that party. It's said the next day he had a blistering hangover and just never got better. He died in 534 AD, around 18 years old, of what historians believe is it's probably maybe alcoholism paired with an underlying condition like diabetes. We don't know.
Or some kind of drug reaction, right? We know they also, put a lot of shit in their booze, so who knows?
Literal shit. And also potentially drugs. We don't know.
And maybe the Emperor's pee. They're pee drinking at this point.
Right. It could have been the pee drinking. I don't know. Excessive drinking was part of Gothic culture. We can go all the way back to Tacitus to see that, where he claims that Germanic chieftains traditionally conducted all state business drunk because drink makes a man honest. It's quite possible that Athalaric was being encouraged to live like a manly Goth by his friends, which meant drinking in excess as part of his culture.
Going back to the pee drinking, sorry.
Of course we have to go back to the pee drinking.
Gotta get back there. I'm wondering if it was maybe Cult of Mithras related.
I would say that if it's going to be a cult that involves pee drinking, it's more likely to be berserker related, Jen.
It could be both. I mean, look, Mithras didn't necessarily start in Rome. He started in a different area and then kind of took over. And he was definitely an underground, man's cult.
Sure, but he was also a Roman imperial cult. So I feel like the Gothic nobility here is really pushing the culture towards, this sort of, ancient Gothic past. So they'd be more likely to have the emperor's son join a cult that is traditionally Gothic versus traditionally Roman, or would have been seen as traditionally Roman. That's my 2 cents.
No, and I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but I know that the Mithridates and the Mithric cult started out in the East and then came over. So why I say this is because the emperor was given quite a strong drug and then he passed it on through his urine and his followers then took it. And maybe there's something like that going on and that's where his weird headache came from. Who knows? Maybe it was an initiation ritual gone really wrong.
Like I said, it's possible. In the sources, it's described as just kind of a really big party. There could have been some cultic rite here that just is not documented. I don't know.
So Athalaric may also have been susceptible to addiction, and maybe his mom knew that about him from the start and had been trying to protect him by urging him toward a more sedate and sober Roman education that emphasized willpower and self-restraint. Maybe she really was struggling with this poor child who, was in the deep throes of addiction. Maybe she despaired seeing her son's self-destruction. Maybe she knew he had some underlying health cause that this kind of behavior would really exacerbate. Maybe she could see what was happening and wasn't able to stop it. That's really sad.
Which makes this whole thing even more tragic.
Again, it's one of those things like we don't know. We're never going to have that answer. But to me, this is some of the really important work that historians and others are doing to let us understand people in the past and what their lives would have looked like and how we can see ourselves in those lives too. This really paints a picture of Amalasuintha and Athalaric in ways that you don't necessarily see on the pages of a textbook or tome. It makes them people.
Right, but you can read between the lines, and some of it's fan fiction, but some of it's very informed fan fiction.
Yeah.
Refreshing wild cherry cola meets smooth cream. The treat you deserve. Pepsi Wild Cherry and Cream. Treat yourself.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
An all-new season of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives is now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney+.
Mom Talk has just been blowing up.
Whitney and Jen are on Dancing with the Stars.
Taylor is a bachelorette.
Saying that out loud is crazy. That is huge.
But all the cool opportunities could pull us apart.
It's causing issues in everyone's marriage.
My whole world is falling apart right now. It's chaos.
Watch the Hulu original series, The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, now streaming on Hulu and Hulu on Disney Plus for bundle subscribers. Terms apply.
So after Athalaric died, Amalasuintha had an heir problem. But beyond that, she had an even more pressing issue, holding on to her rule at present. And while it's not explicitly said in the sources, we're picking up loud and clear that she would rather shove hot pokers underneath her fingernails than get married again. Can't blame her.
Definitely coming across to me.
So Amalasuintha's next move was an unorthodox one. She brought in her cousin Theodahad to rule as a platonic, non-boning in any way, co-regent. She was not about boning in the family, we think, maybe.
Well, they were cousins. So, cousin marriages were pretty common in the ancient world, but she was like, no boning. This is a no boning partnership. So, Theodahad was cool Aunt Amalafrida's son with her unknown first husband. And bringing him in must have been a desperate move, because his whole adult life, Theodahad's relatives had been conspiring to make sure he never got anywhere near the Ostrogothic throne. This isn't explicitly stated, but think about it. What sense does it make that Theodoric had such an heir problem that he had to pick out a rando from Toulouse and fabricate a whole Ostrogothic lineage for him when he had a real Amal very close to hand, his own nephew? And remember, cousin marriages were not a problem in the ancient world at all. What sense does it make that Theodoric never brought Theodahad in to secure the realm when Eutharic died? Theodoric wasn't okay with the prospect of Amalasuintha taking charge on her own either. That's another thing you can read between the lines. No matter how capable she was, it seems very clear to me that the Goths at this point, for whatever reason, were not willing to be ruled by women, even if they were only ruling on behalf of their own young sons. Case in point, instead of leaving his oldest, Theodogotha, in charge in Toulouse, when Alaric II died as a regent for her son, which is a very common arrangement, Theodoric took charge of the kingdom himself. I don't think that's a coincidence. But he would rather leave Amalasuintha to rule on her own rather than bring Theodahad in. Why?
Well, he knew something was off about Theodahad, right? There's something off about this guy, and there always had been. And, it didn't take a genius to see this. You'd only turn to him in the most desperate of occasions. Theodoric knew this. He knew there was something off about Theodahad. That's why he handpicked his own successor, and when he died, he left his daughter to rule alone, rather than let this guy get anywhere near his throne. Over his dead fucking body would Theodahad become king of the Goths. He'd rather have a woman inherit, a woman and a 6-year-old, than that guy.
God, even though her boobs are in the way of everything.
And her moon blood makes her fuzzy. She's not good with those decisions. So Amalasuintha also knew this. Let's be clear. She also knew there was something off about Theodahad. But she must have been desperate. Herwig Wolfram says, quote, her reactions were quick and courageous, indeed even reckless, and they resemble a desperate flight forward. So when the call came from the imperial throne, Theodahad was in Tuscany. Shunned by the Amal ruling family, Theodahad had gotten into real estate. Shady real estate.
Where have we seen this before?
He benefited from the lawlessness of Italy at this time, and how even the mighty Theodoric had trouble enforcing his laws outside his own city. Procopius describes him as, quote, extremely devoted to the pursuit of money, and says that, quote, this Theodahad had gained possession of most of the lands of Tuscany, and he was eager by violent methods to wrest the remainder from their owners, for to have a neighbor seemed to Theodahad a kind of misfortune.
Yeah, so he was basically going around taking people's property from them by force. Not just like small farm holders and stuff, like aristocrats and people with vast estates, I'm assuming. A few years before the current crisis, Theodahad's activities in Tuscany got so bad that Amalasuintha had to enlist the help of Justinian I to get him to knock it off. She even made Theodahad pay restitution to property owners he'd stolen from. Theodahad had held a grudge against her ever since, which she knew about. And that just tells you how desperate her situation was that she'd turned to Theodahad now. Her dad must have been rolling in his grave. Of course, Amalasuintha wasn't a dummy. She was not going to marry Theodahad, and she was not going to give him any direct power. Under the ruling relationship Amalasuintha set up, Theodahad was supposed to play a platonic consort role, swearing fealty to Amalasuintha and serving as a figurehead to calm down the misogynists. And key fact, they were not going to get married, they were not going to bone, and they were not going to have children. Very important.
Very important. This is an unorthodox arrangement for queens, and let's just say that this devolved pretty quickly. Theodahad swore oaths to Amalasuintha, but he never intended to follow them. Apparently, within the year, things were so bad between Theodahad and Amalasuintha that she was considering leaving the entirety of the Ostrogothic Kingdom to Justinian I after her death, cutting Theodahad out of the succession. But Amalasuintha never got time to change her will. Shortly after she appointed him co-regent in 535 AD, Theodahad imprisoned Amalasuintha on the island of Martana in the middle of Lake Bolsena. And then he had her strangled in the bath, as one does when you're trying to get rid of your rival. All of this occurred by April 30th of that year.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out here that basically, I mean, we see this happening in our government now. 4 months in, he's exiled her and had her strangled in the bath. This is probably not legal. Amalasuintha was expecting Theodahad to operate according to the norms of the time. You know, like there were a lot of societal expectations around oaths that she was expecting to hold him even though he was clearly a bad guy that did not hold him. You can't depend on just societal norms to hold back someone who genuinely means to do malicious things.
Yeah, because they don't care.
They don't give a shit. Exactly.
And you know what? Once you give them the keys to the kingdom, it's hard to get the kingdom back.
Or impossible. Look what happened to Amalasuintha. So, the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian I was a powerful friend of Amalasuintha's, and apparently she had been sending him letters about how bad things were. But Theodahad imprisoned her before her messages to him even got through. According to the gossipy Procopius, Justinian would have taken her in and protected her except for the evil Empress Theodora, Justinian's wife. And Procopius really did not like Theodora, so I think that this is a smear campaign, but Procopius tells us that Theodora was desperately jealous of Amalasuintha. Amalasuintha was beautiful, educated, young, they were both in their 40s by now, and Theodora always suspected her husband had a thing for Amalasuintha. Amalasuintha was, quote, from Procopius, of magnificent bearing and exceptional virile manner. Sexy. And She and Justinian had always had a rapport, if you know what I mean.
I mean, they might have been second chance lovers. Who knows?
They had really good banter, that's all.
Exactly. So Theodora did not trust this lady around her husband, and she did not want a rival taking up residence in Byzantium.
According to Procopius, at least.
Yes, according to Procopius, who definitely is being misogynist here. So Theodora sent her own envoy to murder Amalasuintha, but this envoy flinched at the idea of killing a woman, and instead just persuaded Theodahad to do it. And this is, again, probably fan fiction to smear Theodora, because Theodahad already wanted to assassinate Amalasuintha. It was in his bullet journal. It was on his to-do list. Right after imprisoning Amalasuintha on an island in a lake. He was vision boarding it. He was manifesting.
It was step 2. Step 1 was the exile. Step 2 is the assassination. It's in the bullet journal.
Yes, this is what he's going to accomplish. So he's manifesting. So when Justinian I found out Theodahad had Amalasuintha strangled in the bath, he was furious. That became his pretext to send the general Belisarius in to wrest back Italy from the Ostrogoths. Later historians claim that Justinian wanted to reclaim the West for Rome to make the empire as great as it was, and that was also probably true, but this time, in this moment, it was also personal. Two things can be true at once.
So this was the last Gothic War. It lasted from 535 to 554 AD, almost 20 years. It must have been an apocalyptic time. This was the time of the worst year in recorded history, 536 AD, which is when the world was plunged into 18 months of volcanic winter. This was also the time of the plague of Justinian, when the Black Death steamrolled over the Mediterranean from 541 to 549 AD, killing as many as 150 million people, or 60% of the population. Theodahad died in 536 AD, so just about a year or so after he had Amalasuintha killed. And he didn't die at war. The story goes that it was personal, that he was murdered in a rage by one of his own followers, and rumor had it that that follower was put up to it by Vestiges, husband of Amalasuintha, Amalasuintha's daughter, and Vestiges was her son-in-law, so this was like another personal revenge thing. It was Vitiges who wound up taking on the title of King of the Ostrogoths, by the way, and he did a credible job of defending Italy from Belisarius for a while. Ultimately, he was captured and imprisoned in Constantinople in 542 AD, where he died.
His wife, Amalasuintha, was also captured and imprisoned, and Amalasuintha, who'd had to marry Vitiges under duress in the chaos that followed her mother's murder, emerged from captivity to marry a cousin of Justinian I, and they had one child, a son. When her husband died, roughly 14 years later, she was determined to remain single for life, and good for her, she did. Meanwhile, Vitiges' final successor, the last king of the Ostrogoths, Totila, died in a hail of arrows at the Battle of Busta Gallorum, or the Tombs of the Gauls, in 552 AD.
And what's interesting here is that Jordanes was, I believe, in Totila's court. So this would have been a time of extreme upheaval in the Ostrogothic court, and asking Jordanes to, like the great history of the Amals, asking Jordanes to retell that story might have been like a last act of shoring up this idea of Ostrogothic rule.
Yeah. So Italy fell back into Roman hands for a while. Justinian won that war, but many historians see this as a Pyrrhic victory. Italy had been ravaged, its population crashed, and its farmland fallow, its cities depopulated and deserted. Procopius tells us that the war cost 300,000 pounds in gold and over 15 million Gothic lives.
That probably was partially also caused by plague and starvation from like all the climate change and the plague of Justinian and all that. But it wouldn't surprise me that large numbers of people died in Italy during this time, yeah. The Eastern Roman Empire had expended so many resources on this war that it couldn't defend against the Lombards in 568, just 14 years later, and lost control of most of the Italian peninsula for good when the Lombards moved in what was less an invasion and more of a mass migration. Rome would never rise again, not like it was before. Historians point to this part and say this here must have been when Rome fell. And what happened to the Ostrogoths left in Italy after the Ostrogothic Kingdom fell? Well, this is not well documented, but the evidence isn't good for them. One important data point is that the Gothic language itself is believed to have died out in Italy sometime in the later 500s AD, so not long after the Ostrogothic Kingdom fell. In fact, it might have been in the process of disappearing in the midst of all this turmoil. Remember, this peninsula had been undergoing a lot of emergencies. The volcanic winter of 536 AD, the decades of famine that followed, the plague of Justinian from 541 to 549 AD, and it recurred in the decades after, and then decades of war and violence in which Procopius says 15 million Goths died. All of this had served to reduce the population. No doubt, after Totila fell, the Ostrogoths had to find refuge wherever they could. Some may have enlisted in the Byzantine army as they were the ruling power in Italy for a little while after this war. Historians believe others fled over the mountains and straight into the arms of the Lombards, the other Germanic kingdom who invaded Italy after Justinian took it back. And, as for those who stayed, they would have had to find a way to live among the Lombards, another Germanic people again, and it might have been easier than trying to live among Romans, although they would have had to live among them too. But we don't know for sure. So that was the end of the Ostrogothic Kingdom. But what happened to the Visigoths? Stay tuned for that story in the next episode.
So that's it for this week. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the next installment of this series. In the meantime, you can find us on social. We're at Ancient History Fangirl on all the platforms. We're most active on Instagram and our Patreon. You can sign up for our newsletter at ancienthistoryfangirl.com or sign up to our Patreon, which is patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. And I say this every time, but our Patreon is the reason we are still able to keep making this podcast. Without it, we just would not be able to continue bringing you these stories, giving you this look at history through a maybe different lens than you saw it before. So if you appreciate the work we do and you want us to continue doing it, please consider becoming a patron.
This podcast is easily a full-time job for 2 people, and we do not get paid full-time wages to do this.
We don't get paid part-time wages. I mean, we don't really get wages.
It's pretty grim, and our Patreon has been dropping a lot lately. We know that times are tough for everybody. If you can give, we would really, really appreciate it if you could. So you can find that again at patreon.com/ancienthistoryfangirl. And the benefit is you get us more than 2 times a month. We do extra content on there. So if you don't like that we moved to bi-monthly and want us to be weekly again, signing up to our Patreon is the way to once again have that experience. So anyway, we have some patrons to thank this month. Thank you so much. And I apologize if I mispronounce anyone's name. I hope I don't. But thank you so much to Alicia Robinson,
Mallory Hall,
and Musing Madman. Thank you so much for your support. And we will see you all whenever we see you next. Hey everyone, it's Jenny and Jen here, and as a special extra treat, we are giving you a section of the audiobook version of my novel, Enemy of My Dreams.
This is actually the opening chapter or prologue of Jenny's book, and it happened in the aftermath of the Battle of Frigidus in 394 AD, when the Romans put their Gothic auxiliaries in the front of the battle to take most of the casualties. Alaric was leading that band, and he lost about 10,000 men. In Jenny's version of the story, that's the inciting event that radicalizes him towards revolution.
We hope you enjoy this extra snippet, and the book is now out in stores. It is so exciting, and the audiobook is also out, and it is narrated by the brilliant Lisa Flanagan, who does such a good job. I really love her narration. It is so good, and she really brings it to life. Pick it up wherever you get books or audiobooks.
3 days after the last battle ended, the mighty Bora still stalked the floodplain. It shrieked and murmured amongst the broken war machines and sent dust spirals walking amidst the dead. The men were saying it was the wind that won them this war, that the gods had sent it to drive the enemy's arrows back in their faces. Alaric of the Goths set his back to the battlefield, the Bora snapping his cloak around his heels. Someone should tell the gods, then, that the thrice-damned battle is over. Before him, the usurper Eugenius knelt on the ground. Even kneeling, he was thin and stooped as an overtall reed. The wind filled the executioner's stained cloak like a tattered sail and snatched the words from the condemned man's mouth. 10,000 of his own dead to achieve this. Half the Federati, and the Romans had barely scratched their breastplates. A heavy hand clapped down on Alaric's shoulder. Well done. The General Stilicho smiled, jovial as Saturnalia. Without you, we never would have taken that valley. You have covered yourself in glory these past days. Glory. Alaric felt a muscle in his jaw clench. There had been nothing glorious about what happened in that valley. He'd walked out covered only in blood. His men's as much as his enemies. The Emperor Theodosius stepped out of the crowd below, swollen with his own importance. He interrupted Eugenius's last words with a speech about the Christian God who'd brought them victory. Mercifully, the wind obscured most of it. The Emperor will want to see you, Stilicho said. He will want account of your dead, and if you play it right, there will be a reward. You mean the homeland he promised? Alaric could not keep the bitterness from his voice. For years, Theodosius had been promising land, always after the next great victory and the next. His people were still landless and homeless, and now half of them were dead. If that was a coincidence, he'd eat his own boots. Must you do this every time? Stilicho let out an aggrieved sigh. The Emperor owes this victory to you, but you must be politic, Alaric. You stand to gain much, given time. Alaric shook his head grimly. If there was one thing his people did not have, it was time. He remembered the Huns sweeping down from the eastern hills, lines of homesteads burning. It was an old memory, one from his childhood, but it was still happening. Stilicho glanced at his battered, blood-stained cuirass and frowned. Be sure to clean yourself up first. Cut your hair, for God's sake. Try not to look so much like a barbarian. Down below, Theodosius had finished his talk of God. He gave an impassive nod to the executioner. The Bora stopped just as the axe fell. The imperial tent was full of rich fabrics and rare wood, all the comforts the emperor could not do without on campaign. Theodosius sat with his head bent over a solid oak desk, making scratch marks on a wax tablet, his scalp pink with sunburn. Alaric thought of the bent backs, the sweat and suffering that had brought the emperor's desk this far. At length, Theodosius spoke. Your report? By my reckon, we lost 10,000. The emperor's hand stilled. Tell me how you managed to lose half of the Federati. The scouts told us that the rim was clear. It wasn't. The archers picked us off like turtles in a bucket. And you lost 10,000 of my Gothic troops. Theodosius set his stylus down and regarded him coldly. Eyes narrowed like a merchant who suspected weevils in the grain. Stilicho says that without your valor we would all be meat for the crows. But I know that God won us this war. He was the one who sent the wind. Emperor, with respect, Alaric said flatly, your God did not suffer and die to win you that valley. And it serves you to credit him, since he asks neither payment nor land in return. You have a lot of nerve, Theodosius frowned. Perhaps you do not realize you are speaking to your greatest ally, Alaric. I've defended you before the Senate, and you've done nothing to make my work easier. Your people are ungovernable. They pillage when they should be farming. I visit your camps to find women and children wandering about in a war zone. If I granted your people land now, how would I know they would farm it rather than simply using it as a base for plunder? They would not have to follow my army if they had land of their own. If the women and children had somewhere safe to go, I've offered to settle them in camps. Over his steaming corpse. People die like rats in those camps. How do you think it will look to the Senate if I settled 10,000 armed Goths in the Danube Valley so soon after Eugenius turned? If your people turned to pillaging honest Romans, I'd expect to be stoned in the streets." Theodosius paused to pour himself wine, offering none. "Eugenius was part Frankish, you know. My people are Tervingi. That isn't even the same tribe. You know that, and I know that. But to the Senate and the people, you are all the same." Theodosius picked up his stylus and resumed his scratchings. "You are dismissed. You will keep your current position, but only because the Federati are loyal to you. Be grateful for my generosity." Alaric felt his teeth clench, as if it were not abundantly clear how the Romans saw his people. Barbarians, all of them. The Romans could give them the trappings, but in the end, it was his people in the valley fighting more of his people and the Romans reaping the reward. Stilicho would want him to bow and scrape, to make a conciliatory gesture toward the emperor's god. But he would fear no little man in a tent. Not after what he'd lived through. "How long do you think I can keep the Federati loyal, Emperor?" Alaric said quietly. "If they are not paid in full." Theodosius's eyes snapped up. "Is that a threat?" "When I make a threat, you will know it." For a moment, everything stilled. In the Emperor's face was the usual calm disdain. Something made Alaric glance at his upraised hand. It trembled. The Emperor feared him. Suddenly Alaric understood. Theodosius had known he would walk into a slaughter. And Stilicho had given the order. To thin out his numbers against future rebellion. They both thought he'd be next to turn. Deliberately, Theodosius put down his stylus. "You'll do well to remember whose camp you are in," he said evenly, "and whose guards are just outside. And you will do well to remember exactly who the Federati are loyal to." Alaric bared his teeth in an expression that was nothing like a smile. "Pay my men what you owe them, Emperor. Otherwise you had better pray to your god for another wind." Stilicho thought he would turn. It would be a shame to disappoint the great man.
Hello everyone, my name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. Join me on a journey through the most destructive conflict in human history, a journey that will take us not just through the famous campaigns and cataclysmic battles, but also to the lesser well-known corners of the war that touched millions all over the world, as we try and answer not just the questions of what and where, but how and why. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.